All right, our next question, Jim, sent to CornyDriveThru@gmail.com from Jason. A follow-up to a previous question recently. Why did Hulk Hogan wrestle like a heel, even as a babyface? He used weapons, illegal moves, back rakes. Seeing him wrestle, it always perplexed me. Did you ever notice or talk to him?
Okay, that was an abrupt ending. No, Anna, and actually, the longest conversation I ever had with Hulk Hogan was when he was in the Memphis territory in 1979. I was a photographer. And I think he was at the NAPTI convention in 1990 when I was down there, 91, when Pedicino asked me to go down there. And I think we may have said hello, and otherwise, I've never been around a motherfucker in my life. We've always been in different places at different times. However, this came up also on Twitter, and other people were talking about it. If you go back and look, yes, you are correct. He did a lot of that stuff, but he did it as retribution for the heel. Because let's face it, Hogan, especially with his size, a guy that size, that with that body, doesn't look like he should be able to, and wasn't particularly able to, do Ricky Steamboat arm drags and shit. He wrestled more in Japan than he did in the WWF, but at the same time, Vince Jr. didn't care the fuck about the matches. It was the issue and the sizzle, not the steak. So Hogan would come in, he'd do his thing where he shined for a couple minutes, and then the heels would cheat and either use numbers advantage or a manager or illegal tactics or whatever and get a little steam on him. And when he decided it was time, then he'd hulk up and he'd give the heel back all the shit they gave to him. He'd punch him, or he'd hit him with a chair, or he'd fucking rake their back or gouge, or whatever the case, and leg drop, and there you go. And the way in context and the way that he was presented, it worked, but you weren't going to get any, not only scientific wrestling, because he wasn't that kind of a baby face, but you weren't going to get, okay, lock up, headlock, one tackle, drop down, hip toss, drop kick, arm drag, get it again, because he ain't going to be doing that shit anyway. And he couldn't. He didn't need to. So there you go.
Was there a big argument, or I guess at the time, would there have been a big argument in general about the idea of putting your belt on someone so big who was a babyface?
Well, it's sort of like that the WWF style, which became the WWF style, was always the bizarro world of wrestling anyway. What worked there was the opposite of what worked almost everywhere else in the country. In the New York territory, they always had a babyface champion for long runs. Everywhere else, the babyface had to win the title because it would make him somewhat emasculated if he didn't after a long chase, but never held it a long time because the wisdom was that the heel champion that the babyface could chase, the money was in the chase, not the capture. Quality of matches. Let's face it, even though that the New York territory had a bunch of quality workers go through there at one time or another because there was a lot of money to be made there, even the guys who had great matches everywhere else didn't really have them there because the rings were hard, the buildings were big, the matches were short, and they were used to get in and get out. Right? And every once in a while, you'd get the guys that had the pride in the profession, but otherwise, if in New York or in Philadelphia or in Boston, they're not asking you like they do in Memphis or in St. Louis or in Atlanta or Tampa, go 30 minutes, get juice, complicated finish. We're going to try to get some heat, come back next week with a rematch. Instead, just go 8 minutes and do something simple. So that's the whole issue was the New York territory was built and had constant ownership and administration for so long doing the same stuff. That's how their fans were educated. And we've talked about how they always like the ethnic superhero because that's a great majority of their audience, especially when from the 40s through the 80s, the English language media took the piss out of wrestling every chance they got in New York. The ethnic heroes were over. That didn't fly in most other places, maybe in Los Angeles, down in Texas. But you wanted the all-American babyface hero to be the top guy because that reflected the audience. It was different in the Northeast. Do you put a belt on a guy that big was your question. The reason for that was, how do you get it off of him? That's why Andre never wore a championship belt, or they did a couple of regional things just for shits and grins. But Vince didn't have that issue because he wanted Hogan to be a superhero. And until he got everything he could out of it, he didn't want to think about taking it off of him. And then he could make a supervillain. And if he had another superhero in the wings, because that's the way that they always did it. So they did a lot of things that were against conventional wisdom in the wrestling business everywhere else in the country, but only because they had the advantage of having educated their fans in their territory to what worked, just like every other promoter did. They just educated them to different things. Make sense?